This grassy field behind us contains an abandoned cemetery that yields several mysteries but few answers for us. The cemetery, known as the Brickyard Cemetery to those of us who have worked on it for so long, is the final resting place for African American workers who helped produce bricks at the local factory and those workers' family members. Schuyler Marshall Sr., along with his partners, started the Dallas Pressed Brick Company in 1904. Then, that was way west of the township of Mesquite. The factory was the first industrial business in the area and was built here because of the natural occurring yellow clay formation, which obviously yielded really good bricks. We believe Mr. Marshall set aside approximately 3 acres of his 28-acre site for the African American workers, which included a small area across the creek for a cemetery, although that cemetery was never deeded in Dallas County records. The community included a wooden school, which doubled as a church, and homes that were to serve the workers. In 1939, the wooden school was replaced with a brick structure, and in the 1940s, it was led by Professor W.O. Gray, a well-respected Mesquite ISD principal, and his wife, Osie. I can't tell you how pleased I am today that some of Professor Gray's children have been able to come and be with us today. And if you would you please raise your hands? Thank you all so much. The cemetery is actually laid out across South Mesquite Creek. We know this because Mr. C.J. Souls, Jr., the vehicle manager of the brick plant, reached out to us during our research phase and told us that it was his job to make sure the path to the cemetery was cleared for the workers. Mr. Souls' father was the plant superintendent, and he made sure to instill a strong work ethic in his son and a love of all people. Mr. Souls has since passed on, but he never left this area as his home was just a couple of miles south of this spot that we're on right now. We know very little about the people who inhabited the site or the ones left behind in the cemetery. In our research, we reached out through several newspapers and some radio stations to try to find some family members, and we found a few remaining family members, but were not able to capture their stories on tape, which I'm very sad about that, before they passed away. The Dallas Pressed Brick Company sold to Ferris Brick Company in the early 20th century, and it eventually closed in the 1950s. We believe the last interment here was the Reverend Robert Dabney in 1945. The company closed. The African American workers moved away from the site. The homes were torn down, and the school, which had been replaced with a newer brick structure in 1939, remained the only part of the area for a while. When Mesquite ISD integrated in 1964, the brick school, too, was torn down 5 years later. Sometime thereafter, all this land was sold to private investors. We may never have gathered here today if it hadn't been for a neighbor, Mr. Owen E. Haar. He called the newly formed Historic Preservation Office and asked why nothing had been done to commemorate this cemetery. Mr. Haar said he had moved to Mesquite in 1964 and had noticed the headstones, which had begun to disappear over time. At this point, several of us here in the city came together to investigate his story. What we found was that another organization had looked into the cemetery in the 1970s but had not been able to pull together a big enough movement to preserve it. In September of 76, the Mesquite Historical and Genealogical Society published a partial listing of those buried at this site, and those names are on the plaque on the memorial. Then in 1984, when the city began work on Peachtree Road, the engineering department's field notes did include an existing cemetery. That gave us all the information we need. We knew there was a cemetery here, and we were able to reach out to the Texas Historical Commission. An archaeological steward from Austin investigated the area. His research led him to believe there are approximately 80 graves behind us on an east-west line between the Union Pacific Railroad right-of-way and South Mesquite Creek. Nathan Meyer and Associates Engineering worked with the surveyor. They surveyed the site and gave the city a good map by which to work. Historic Mesquite Incorporated applied for a state historical cemetery designation and received the marker in 2002. The city negotiated with the private landowners for the site in order to preserve it from development. And finally, we filed the cemetery in county records. Yay! The Mesquite NAACP, Historic Mesquite, and Johnny Booth Architects began working on the project for a memorial. Mr. Booth and Mr. William Holloman, a former president of the NAACP, have both passed on, but their impact is certainly felt here today. Mrs. Darlene Holloman is here today, and Mrs. Booth and her gorgeous son that looks just like Johnny Booth is here too. Thank you so much for being with us. On April 26th, artifacts that we had gathered when we first started exploring this land were lowered into the memorial during its construction. Today's dedication is the culmination of many people's efforts in getting this cemetery the recognition that it deserves, and that we know these people will never be forgotten again. Thank you.